President-elect Trump's new appointment decisions could speak volumes about which direction his administration is taking. Some of them hardline Republicans with a history of going against the grain. I want to bring in Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. He is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Murphy, thanks very much for joining us.
Sure.
Today. So let's look at some of these appointments today. These are very key appointments in the national security space in any administration. Michael Flynn, he does not require Senate confirmation. But will Democrats call for Trump to rescind that nomination as they did for Steve Bannon?
I think we have to be very concerned about Michael Flynn being on the inside of U.S. national security strategy. This is someone who was relieved of his duties working in the defense intelligence field. He then did something unprecedented, which was to walk outside of the military and criticize his former boss, his commander-in-chief, which virtually no one does in the military today. And he brings into the White House a set of incredibly dangerous views about Islam. He has basically made his name by saying that the United States should declare war on Islam as a religion, that the entire religion presents a threat to the United States. First, that is fundamentally untrue. This is not the Crusades. But second, that is bulletin board material for terrorist recruiters. What ISIS wants desperately right now, as they are losing territory inside Iraq and Syria, is for the United States to do something that draws more recruits into its fold. And there is nothing that we could do that would be a better recruitment tool for ISIS than to declare that the United States is at war with the entirety of the Islamic religion.
They don't need you to confirm him, but will you do something to try to stop him? Will you ask for his nomination to be rescinded?
I think this is a very dangerous pick, and I would hope that Donald Trump would rethink the selection of General Flynn. I would hope that he would put someone next to him in the White House who is going to counter some of his more impulsive instincts, not feed into them. I think what we're missing right now is some very sober-minded, experienced diplomats in the White House. Right now, we seem to have political operatives rather than experienced foreign policy hands, and I think that's something that all Americans should be very concerned about.
Let's talk about Senator Jeff Sessions. You will hear, and folks are now familiar, that in the 80s, when he was brought up for a federal judgeship, he was rejected by a Republican-controlled Senate at the time for espousing positions that were perceived as racist. Since then, in the campaign, rather the transition team made the point that he has defended desegregation, he's voted for the extension of the Voting Rights Act, etc. You worked with him in the Senate. Do you have doubts about Senator Sessions in terms of his commitment to voting rights, civil rights?
Well, I accept that people can change, and I think it is important for us to remember that, as you said, it was a Republican-led Senate that decided he wasn't worthy to sit on the bench. But many of us have worked with Jeff in the Senate, and I want to hear from him in his confirmation hearings whether he still holds these views that he made very public about his disdain for African Americans in and around Alabama. And I want to hear about his views on the reform of the criminal justice system to try to right some of these wrongs. I mean, if he's serious about being a changed man, then work with us on trying to end a criminal justice system that targets African Americans and Hispanics at a rate that is unprecedented in this country. So let's hear from him. Let's give him an intense vetting. A lot of us know him. A lot of us personally like him. But we've got to hear whether he really is going to be a reformed man as our Attorney General.
Mike Pompeo seems to be getting more bipartisan support. I've heard that from Democratic House members and senators as well as Republicans. You've worked with him as well. What's your view of him as CIA director?
So I don't know Mike as well. He was in the House of Representatives while I was in the Senate. So I think it's too early for many of us in the Senate to judge Mike. But again, the trend line that worries me is that most of the people that we have seen, Pompeo is actually an exception. Pompeo supported Rubio before he supported Trump. Yep. But most of the people that we're seeing selected for these key national security posts seem to be first loyalists and second experienced foreign policy thinkers. And so I'd like to see some more people that maybe were outside of the Trump camp, but can bring some expertise to the administration on how to keep this country safe.
Obamacare, Donald Trump on the campaign said he was going to repeal it. Since then, he's expressed some flexibility on it. What are Democrats going to do? Do you have a plan to stop the repeal of Obamacare if the Republican-led Congress goes that way?
Well, I've almost 250,000 people in Connecticut who have gotten care through the Affordable Care Act, 80% satisfaction rates of those who have signed up, record signups just in the last month. I think the challenge here is that Republicans don't know how to repeal this law. There's no way to keep the good parts of the law, as Republicans say, and get rid of the parts Republicans don't like. Donald Trump has said he wants to continue the provision that stops insurance companies from charging sick people more. As he will find out quickly, you cannot do that without requiring that everyone have insurance. Right. You cannot do that without having subsidies to help people buy insurance. So this whole idea of keeping the good parts, getting rid of the bad parts, it's a total fiction. And so many of us are going to be waiting to see what Republicans propose. They've had this great deal for the last 8 years. They've been able to say they want to repeal it and replace it without actually telling us what the replacement is. Donald Trump said on the campaign trail that people would have better health care for lower cost by repealing the Affordable Care Act. Let's wait and see if he can pull that off.
Now's the test. Senator Chris Murphy, thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
Appreciate it.